But I'm going to call first on Cosmin to open the seminar. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. This. Okay, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. My name is Cosmin Corendea. I work as Associate Academic Officer for United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security in Bonn, Germany. And yes, United Nations has a university, and we are considered to be the academic arm of the United Nations in 1972. We are not very well known because we are focusing mostly on research and scientific support for the UN agencies around the world. Basically what is happening that if someone needs some science behind the action they do in the field in regards to the United Nations policies and regulations, they usually come to us. And this is how we do end up with doing research. The Institute for Environment and Human Security is focusing mainly on climate change related issues in regards to different topics like insurance, or like microinsurance related to climate change, migration related to climate change, social vulnerability, resilience, and lately in the last 3 years since I joined the United Nations University, they are tackling the legal aspects of climate change as well in regards to rights-based approaches and climate justice and equity. And I will present you a case which I was part of it very little. This is not actually the findings. They are not my, so I cannot take any credit for the findings of the case study. However, the case study, which was called shortly Rainfalls, was a very well received case study in regards to climate change and migration. Basically, it is a global case study which is trying to answer a simple question, and that will be how the rainfall is influencing the migration of the people due to climate change triggers. They are done with the main partners and donors, and there was CARE, MacArthur Foundation, and AXA, and it was conducted in 8 case studies around the world, 2 in Central and South America, Guatemala and Peru, 2 in Africa, Ghana and Tanzania, and 4 in Asia, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, and Thailand. The study took place for 3 years, and local researchers from our partners, including researchers from our institute, were deployed in the field and conducted research for several months. The results which were picked up from the research done in the field was taken back to Bonn, and using a modeler we tried to come up with some numbers and some generalities if that would have been the case. So as I told you, 3 years, and the summer, it was from summer 2011 to winter 2012. The objectives of the project were to understand how rainfall variability, food security, and human mobility interfere today, to understand how these factors might interact in coming decades as the impact of climate change begins to be felt more strongly, and to work with communities to identify ways to manage rainfall variability, food livelihood, insecurity, and migration. It showed that the rainfalls, it's so different in these parts of the world that the influences over the household, over the people who are affected by it, it's quite different in perspectives. So that will imply not necessarily a top-bottom approach, because you have such details and particularities of each case study which have to be actually looked the other way around, from bottom-up approach. This way you are going to the communities and you are addressing the needs of the specific household or communities, instead of coming up with a policy which is somewhere in the air above and coming to imply it on the ground. We used a very large research methodology, and one of the unicity of this project was that we tried to do multiple methodological approaches. We try to do expert interview, household surveys, and participatory research approach, which all combined at the end by the modeler from Bonn came up with this complicated statistics and graphs, which allowed us to come up with some basic conclusions for the project itself. We had a lot of publications coming out of that project, and we had a methodology report. We had several publications related to case study. Each case study has its own publication, and could be found on the website of Rainfalls, and I'll provide you later with the details. So this is the short and simple version of what the findings of the case study showed us in regards to how the rainfall influenced the migration of the households. Of course, the main reason why people are migrating due to the rainfall, it's basically food security. Addressing communities which are affected by climate change, usually the food security becomes a very important issue, and that considering that the livestock which the people are owning is not that developed due to not such a high level of richness, if you want. And the food security comes in different parts of the year and in different parts of they can be seasonal, they can be temporary, and then when the household has to take a decision how to secure that food security. As we are in the law faculty and I have a legal background, I will tell you that, for example, in the last years, it was proved that 30% of the climate change related studies are related to migration. So migration, the first tendency, the first effect of a human rights violation in regards to climate change, if you want, or if you want a breach of any environmental principles or legal agreements, it's migration. I won't say refugee because we are going into too deep waters, but I will keep it to migration. So this is the tendency what people have when they are affected by climate change. What I have to do, and it was proved that 30% of them have a tendency to go temporarily or to go permanently. That's another discussion. But that people have it's assumed that they are used to the climate change triggers. However, because of the high intensity and the high frequentality in the last years of the climate change, of the let's call them meteorological events, triggered to take decisions which they were not familiar with. Some of them are migrants by nature. They are migrating just because this is what they've done in the past and this is what their families are doing for generations. But some of them became migrants just of this food security scarcity. So this is what people are triggered to do when the climate change event is happening. And this rainfall study actually proved that at different levels, like crop modification, reduced food consumption, desertification of income activities, reduced expenditure, selling of assets, rely on external help. But migration, it was proved that it plays the main role. Why? Because they have a tendency, especially from the rural areas, to go to urban areas and then try to improve the income and then to come back and support the household. These are 4 household profiles which were found by the project. And as I told you, it was the migration to improve the household resilience. The migration used to survive but not to flourish. And then it was the erosive coping strategy and, like, if you want, trapped populations, people who do not have other options but migrate in order to survive. And of course, it's on the level of income, because people with more income and eventually some livestock ownership, they have a tendency to improve their resilience. And for example, in a case in Africa, and I will give an example in Tanzania here, it was proved that, for example, due to climate change, the dry season became the wet season, and the wet season became the dry season. So people being confused and not being regular migrants during the dry season because the wet season is not there and they have to support their livelihood. It was somehow mixed up, and then people ended up migrating in the months where they were not familiar with, and targeting, if you want, the receiving communities in periods of the year when nobody was expecting. So you have to migrate to, in order to support your livelihood. For example, I'm just giving an example, in the months of the summer, January, February, and March, for example. And this is where people were not expecting them to migrate, because that was the wet season usually. And this is where the people are not expecting any migrants to come to their communities. So it had a double impact, if you want, on the sending community because of this climate change confusion, and on the other hand on the receiving communities, which are impacted directly, especially on the labor market. The conclusions are very simple and I mean very strict, and the study showed very strict numbers and statistics which help come up with this general perception of climate changes in the form of rainfall variability. And there are different challenges of the projects, of course, and one of them was that the household characteristics do matter in regards to the local traditions, customs, and sometimes policies, and future pressure on rainfall dependent livelihoods and its impact on human mobility. This is what the actions which are proposed to be done, and it has to be done a global work in regards especially to climate change in general, national and local plans, especially to NAPs, to national adaptations policies, livelihood improvements when the state has the capacity to support the people in order to increase their livelihoods, and to support the livelihood in the periods of the year when the livelihood is not supported by the weather. Integration and participation of people who are excluded, socially excluded based on their income, and support contact migration and prevent erosive migration in order to look at the migration at the good side of adaptation. So you have to look at migration as adaptation and not necessarily migration as a failure to adaptation. Some people have a tendency to consider that migration it's in the capacity of a person to adapt to a present situation. But this study actually showed the other way around. It is migration as a way to adapt to the situation. As I mentioned, this was the global policy report, and this global policy report, because of our position in Bonn in Germany, reached the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we usually, UNFCCC has its Bonn talks every June, and as you know, the Community of Parties conference every year in the winter. And these findings of the Rainfalls projects were presented to the UNFCCC, and somehow it is impacting at the policy level. I would like also to mention that, for example, from the Cancun Adaptation Framework from 2010, there is a paragraph which is paragraph 14F, and that paragraph 14F was actually developed by United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, and it's actually the first paragraph in a climate change related document which is mentioning migration. Shortly, that was it. Thank you.
If there are any immediate questions, we can take one or two, and we will have a panel discussion. But if there are any immediate questions for Cosmin before we move on.
Just maybe on the time frame of migration for populations that don't normally migrate, you know, when does it kick in? Is there a time frame where people react to the conditions so that they do migrate? You know, you gave a very short example there in Tanzania, but would people react that quickly to?
It depends from country to country. For example, in Vietnam, people had a tendency to react quite quickly because they don't expect anything better to happen. So depending, that's one aspect, and it's a matter of tradition. Because, for example, in Vietnam, especially in delta areas, people are regular migrants. So this is like a tradition which they had done for hundreds of years, and migration for them is not something special. When they face a problem in relation to climate change or any other income-related problems, they have this tendency to go and to address the problem in other places in order to come back with remittances and support the household. This is Vietnam, so for example, this is a characteristic of Vietnam. In Tanzania, for example, the people had a tendency to migrate based on the income level. If they have a very low income level, then the people are migrating faster than the people who have some financial resources, in order to support for a while and to try to adapt without any migration to climate change, to the specific climate change triggers. And then eventually, at the point in time when they see that the financial resources are diminished, then they take the decision to migrate.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, that was good.
Thank you.